because of the long troubled relationship between Native peoples and the others who came to their homelands, Native peoples are given special considerations in the research review process. All of the basic protections provided in the IRB process for non-Native people also apply to Native people. For example, if someone wants to conduct a study that focuses on Navajo people, they do need to go through informed consent. They do need to get the approval of the Institutional Review Board. Participants also have the right to withdraw at any time. A risk-benefit analysis must be conducted. Vulnerable populations are protected, and privacy and confidentiality must be maintained. But Native people also have additional protections. So too often, non-Native researchers have been interested in learning from what Native people have known, but have done so in a way that disrespects Native people, those very people from whom the researchers want to learn. So, for instance, what is called a distant gaze perspective, in which a researcher would go to a Native community, and even as they were a part of it, they would try to stand outside and observe with objectivity what the people were doing, which seems a violation of the personal relationships that were created and reducing the Navajo people to specimens. They failed to collaborate with Native peoples when they were designing the research. So the outsider, the researcher, would determine what questions they wanted to ask and how the study should be conducted, and then not ask any of the Native people about their views of what would be a way to answer the question. The studies that they designed would generally be intended to take that distant gaze and understand or learn more about Native people, but the studies wouldn't have any benefit to the people themselves. And finally, very often they wouldn't persist, they would leave the communities without sharing anything about their results or conclusions or anything with the very people who had provided the information. So in response to this sort of thing, the Indigenous Research Protection Act established general guidelines for how things should be handled, and then within those guidelines, each tribe established their own rules, policies, and procedures for implementing these guidelines. So you can see at the link on the slide that the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board has certain guidelines outlined. And in a nutshell, all research activities should be implemented in a knowledgeable, sensitive manner that is respectful of tribal sovereignty and reflects tribal cultural protection and preservation concerns. And I'll add that all of the information here is adapted from material provided by the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. So what do these principles mean? Native-centered is the first principle. What it means is that Native communities and people are the driving force of the research. So they're behind the research, creating the impetus. Native knowledge is at the heart of the research endeavor, and Native people are the leaders and the voice. No more stepping outside and observing in that detached, objective manner. Nothing, to quote, nothing about us without us. Native people want to be included as active partners in the process. Research activity and action, if it's Native-centered, will be centered on issues that are central to the Native community, not the issues that are central to the research center or to the sponsoring institution or to the sponsoring agency. So here's an example. This is again from the University of Alaska. Researchers spent many hours attending, so in this really nice Native-centered approach, researchers spent many hours attending community programs, supporting public events, and connecting informally with community members. Members from the community, like family members, youth, service providers, elders, and cultural leaders, participated in the research planning meetings and in the meetings after that as the research was moving forward. By respectfully listening to what the community wanted, researchers could integrate their ideas into the grant proposal. And so you would ask yourself, is your work Native-centered? Are you working to achieve your own agenda, or are you working with a community to assist in visualizing, articulating, and developing their plan of action? And secondly, is your institution able and willing to give this Native community the time, resources, and expertise needed to meet their expectations? So commit. Commit. Principle 2 is respect. Treat all individuals and communities participating in research with respect. It is an honor to work with Native peoples in research. Purposefully seek understanding of the community and their reasons for collaborating in research. Respect and honor tribal sovereignty, cultural traditions, and diversity among and within Native communities. Be aware of and respectful of existing community protocols. So these are all about taking back the ego of the researcher who thinks they might be better, perhaps because they have an advanced degree, or perhaps because they come from a different culture or have more money. And so this requires that the researchers step back from that position and respect the people, even feel humbled and honored to work with the people who are providing this rich information, this rich help. And so that can be a big step in some ways. So an example of a respectful approach, a community listening to a research proposal said, "We've been researched to death and we never see anything come out of the research." And so the person who was presenting the research recognized that the community members might be responding to past injustices of researchers. And so the researcher listened and validated their concerns by asking, "What is it that I can do differently?" One person said, "Show your respect by spending time in our community, being patient and listening when leaders speak, attending our community events, and advocating for our tribe's voice to be heard. Sit back, listen, and be involved." So this individual who responded clearly saw that sometimes people were coming in like in a big hurry, eager to get their agenda done, and not giving the time to know the people or even to listen when somebody is speaking. And so this imperative is a slowing down imperative. And so ask yourself, are you aware of the protocols for research projects and for convening and facilitating meetings? Do I know someone who can teach me the protocols? Or are you, or as it says here, am I aware of and respecting the government structure, laws, policies, as well as the specific procedures for engaging in research with the community? Are you aware of ways in which the Native community's laws might differ from the laws of and policies of the institution, university, and state? Principle 3 is self-reflection and cultural humility. You can see in the image here, we have an image of a bidirectional communication. So one person, perhaps the researcher, mentors the person who is the participant. And at the same time, the person who is the participant mentors the person who is the researcher. And so this researcher is willing to learn, doesn't think that his or her knowledge is any better than the knowledge of the other people. And so both sides are respecting two things, that they have something to contribute, each side. And each side is recognized that the other also has a valuable offering. And so the focus together has heart in the center And then it has the ideas, the science, the people, and the promoting of the research. So be mindful of one's own cultural and class biases and how these biases can affect researcher interactions with Native people. Strive to develop self-awareness and have a respectful and humble attitude toward diverse points of view and traditions. Self-awareness, recognizing your biases, and as you recognize them, cutting them back. Base your research on the understanding that Native people have wisdom, knowledge, expertise, and experience that are relevant to their community and to the efforts of investigators. Refrain from believing that one has attained cultural competence, as it is a lifelong process. And in here they're saying, even if you've worked a long time, maybe even if you are a Native person yourself, still don't believe that you've attained cultural competence, because even you might have many things that you do not know about the people you're working with. It takes all your life and then some. So an example of a reflective and humble approach: a Native researcher was attending a meeting in her own Native community where she was introduced as, quote, a resource from the university who handed out program materials and business cards. The community's initial response was, we are all resources too, and they pushed the researcher's materials aside. The researcher realized that this introduction and the institutional authority implied in this introduction, that she considered herself an expert who was superior to others. She reflected on this and learned a more humble mindset in which she recognized the community members as equals. And so we go from arrogance to humility. Arrogance is fault-proof. They can do no wrong. Don't listen, might interrupt, wants to be right, doesn't see differently, pushes points through, shows frustration very easily, avoids accountability, and creates a culture of fear. But humility admits mistakes, listens not just to give the appearance of listening, but to really understand. So listening with one's heart. Gives space instead of interrupting. Space for someone to speak, and maybe even a silence after that person speaks. Humility has an open mind instead of wanting to be right. Humility embraces differences, celebrates differences instead of just sticks to their own guns. Humility allows ideas to emerge instead of having the answer already in one's head and pushing it through. Humility shows patience instead of this quick, easy frustration. Humility takes ownership of making mistakes, as we had in our example, instead of avoiding accountability. And humility builds a culture of learning, shared learning, instead of fear. Principle 4 is authentic relationships. Building relationships that are sincere, enduring, and based upon mutual trust and respect. Relationship-based research will emerge and survive through challenges with positive transformations on all sides of the partnership. Enter into partnerships with the community and community members with the intention of building and sustaining a long-term commitment to the community. So here's an example of an authentic approach. A local researcher was asked to assist a rural Native community during a crisis. He gave the community his full attention and was genuine in his willingness to serve, engaging with many community members and providers as they coped. Once the crisis was over, the community asked him to work on other projects that would benefit the tribe. Again, he was genuine and always willing to help. His years working with the tribe have led to authentic partnerships and lasting friendships. Community members often call him and send him emails when they want him to review something. The tribal members have grown fond of the provider and engage in research projects with him to this day. Trust goes from authenticity. And so I think here we see the researcher, even though the researcher probably has many things to do, like we all do, but this researcher, I think it was a he, sees work with the community as a priority. And so when they ask him to help or to do something or work on other projects, he's able to set aside those other things and remember where his priorities are and work with them in an authentic, genuine way. Principle 5 is to honor community timeframes. Concepts of time differ among various cultures, influenced by seasonal cycles, traditional events, government functions. Research culture. The research culture in this country, especially for people working in the really big universities, there's a lot of pressure for them to get things done quickly. They have to publish a certain number of papers per year or they don't keep their job, for example. And so that kind of pressure exists, and this really should be 2 bullet points. So the first is that this pressure to get things done quickly might make the researcher want to zip in and zip out without really having a commitment to the community and maybe without taking time to share the results. So that's one thing that can go wrong. But a second thing is if the community asks the researcher for support or collaboration on a project, then sometimes the details of science would cause it to go so slow, whether the Native people, they need action now, but there might be so many delays that they don't know if it would even meet the demands of community. Time is such a challenge, isn't it? Many Native people value time to process information. This time may be used to reflect on new concepts or translate the concepts into Native thought. Provide time for moments of thoughtful silence. Sometimes as I'm delivering these kinds of lectures, I feel like right here there's a violation of time and that we should be engaging in these conversations together with lots of time to process the ideas instead of this way that we're forced to teach in an online environment on a semester schedule. So an example of a time-aware approach. When planning research, a researcher asked a local tribal community member what to keep in mind during the year-long project. And this liaison, or the tribal community member, described all kinds of events like ceremony, political activities, funerals, school functions, and so forth throughout the year, and recommended that the researcher develop a timeline that encompassed both the research and community events. So in response, the researcher made sure to keep her timeline flexible and allow additional time at the end for unexpected community events. Principle 6 is build on strengths. Become aware of strengths and particular abilities within Native communities. Explicitly recognize these aspects and build upon them. Focus on the community's culturally protective strengths and other assets throughout all stages of research. Use a tone in your written research that emphasizes resiliency factors and inspires hope. And so this is such a nice example that's being described here. A new researcher was excited to begin a project in a Native community and came to the initial meeting with data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Department of Health and Indian Health Services. He brought up concerns regarding high rates of alcohol use, depression, diabetes, and adverse childhood events among this population, asking community partners why and how these statistics are played out in their community. After the initial meeting was over, the community partners were left with feelings of negativity and hopelessness. They were not sure that they wanted to continue working with the researcher because he pointed out all the bad things going on in their community. This might have been avoided had the researcher balanced out his meeting by bringing forth some positive qualities inherent in this community. So we can do this in our daily lives, we can do this with ourselves, and of course as researchers we can do this. Rather than focusing on what is wrong that must be eliminated, let's place the focus on what is right that could be magnified. And that seems to be, on many levels, an approach that benefits the outcomes of the projects. Principle 7, co-learning and ownership, resourceful, reciprocal, back and forth. Co-learning involves a reciprocal exchange of knowledge and ideas. Tribal members bring their expertise across multiple areas. Researchers bring expertise in academic research methods and processes. Communities learn and benefit in ways that better their community. Researchers benefit by gaining important knowledge from community members. And this reciprocal approach is, I think, exactly as it should be, recognizing that everybody has this valuable contribution and that no one contribution is any better than any other contribution. Researchers acknowledge that everyone has important contributions to make. And Native communities have the right to ownership and control over their data and may choose whether to share ownership of that data. So this is important. This plays out a lot in our IRB. What happens to the data of a study that's conducted here when the study is over? And in current Navajo Nation law, the Navajo Nation owns the data. And that brings up challenges for a student who might want to use their data that they collected in a study they did as an undergrad and go on to graduate school and continue to use those data. So this is a question that it absolutely, is appropriate that it is this way, that the Native cultures claim direct ownership of the data collected in a study. Too many times they've been treated as observation subjects with that distant gaze. But it does bring real life challenges in this day and age, especially with our students who are conducting research, and some of these questions we're still working on. And an example of a reciprocal approach, Native Community and Research Center collaborated to determine the degree to which culture and traditions would be included in the project. Both community members and researchers took different sections of the grant to write, with all contributing equally to the final product. Research partners provided technical assistance during the grant writing process to facilitate the community's capacity to write grants on their own in the future, and community members helped researchers gain approval from tribal leaders. Researchers learned the approval process in the community, while community members learned the approval process through the institutional IRB. This process helped build capacity for the community and for the researchers, instilling a sense of pride and ownership that carried the project forward even after the funding ended. Principle 8, continual dialogue. Communication is a two-way street. Ensure that communication to the members of the community involved is understandable, relevant, and accessible. I feel like I all the time talk too fast, and I think I should be very aware of that when I'm speaking if I were to present to members of the community. Seek two-way communication. A continual and open dialogue may facilitate co-learning, prevent misunderstandings, and address concerns before they become problems. Our digital age makes it very easy for us to do one-way communication. Even texts, isn't quite as two-way as we might wish it to be. And, all of us, I can point to myself most certainly, and perhaps others of us as well, need to take active steps for an open dialogue, for communication that really is a genuine back and forth, rather than the kind of remote communication that tends to dominate in our internet type culture, especially post-COVID. Be proactive in finding out the appropriate people and programs needed for ongoing communication within each community and research project. Who knows what you need to know? Who are the right people? And provide findings back to community stakeholders on an ongoing basis. A researcher came before the tribal council, and the council said, "When was the last time you provided this council with an update on this project?" Researcher says, "I have not provided an update to the council since the project was approved 2 years ago. I didn't know I had to." The council's questioning caused the researcher to reflect on her own expectations for communication, leading her to put more effort in aligning with the community's protocol for how information flows between the community and the researcher. Principle 9 is transparency and accountability. Be open and clear about all activities and information throughout the research process in order to build trust, which may have been compromised by past negative research endeavors in the community. Take responsibility for all actions and consequences of those actions. An example, a tribal leader was concerned at the way her community was portrayed on a researcher's webpage. When asked about this information, the researcher stated that he had assumed the proper approvals had already been obtained and the posting was not his fault. The researcher did not reveal that he had deliberately avoided informing them for fear that it would cause unneeded discussion and delays over a seemingly small detail. The community lost some trust with this researcher for not being open and for not taking responsibility to remedy the situation. Principle 10, integrity. And of course, you saw this word mentioned much in the general principles related to human research review. So be vigilant about protecting Native communities and individuals from harm. Work to preserve and strengthen the wholeness of Native peoples and communities who have been damaged by disrespect and much worse. Understand that the community's rights take precedence over the researcher's pursuit of knowledge and personal career development. Act with honesty and morality through every phase of the research. Adhere to existing ethical guidelines that are developed for and by Native peoples and communities, in addition to general ethical guidelines for researchers. A tribal council required a researcher to delete a major finding from his submitted presentation before they would give approval for the researcher to present at an upcoming conference. After much discussion, the researcher asked if there was any way that the information could be presented in a more acceptable manner in order to keep this central finding in the presentation. Ultimately, the researcher took out this finding from the presentation. This must have been a tough decision because it said it was a central finding. The researcher struggled with which guidelines to adhere in order to maintain the integrity of his work, and decided that the reasons for which this Native community had asked him to take out his findings had greater justice for this community than would be demonstrated in presenting the findings. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And Principle 11 is community relevance. Be mindful that the historical experiences directly relate to the Native community's present situation and impact the relevance of any research project. Develop research projects that have meaning and purpose within the Native community's ways of being and knowing. Ensure that the research findings are useful and accessible to participating communities by providing information that contributes to tribal-specific solutions, greater well-being, and positive policy impact. So an example of an approach that's relevant. Notice the flexibility of the researcher in our example. A researcher came before a tribal leadership to present an HIV, which is AIDS, prevention project that she wanted to begin at a school-based clinic in the village, supporting counseling and testing as an HIV prevention strategy. Leadership was skeptical of the need for such an intervention and questioned whether it was the most productive use of the clinic's limited resources, indicating that the well-being of their youth was of utmost importance, and that they were open to other project ideas that may better meet concerns such as substance abuse and teen pregnancy and the loss of their tribal language. The researcher still hoped to offer her expertise in children's behavioral health, but also realized her previous proposal did not take into account the community's present concerns. Later, the researcher developed a comprehensive substance abuse and risky sexual behavior prevention project that focused on strengthening cultural identity through language preservation. Tribal leadership endorsed the project and devoted tribal resources to support the program. And I like the image here, what you want to say and what they're interested in. Relevance is that middle ground. That is the end of this presentation, in which we outlined the 11 principles that are added to the initial principles when working with Native people.